Well, my text this morning is 2 Kings chapter 5, and I want to speak on verse 1. 2 Kings chapter 5 and verse 1, this is how the verse reads. Now Naaman, captain of the host of the king of Syria, was a great man with his master, and honorable, because by him the Lord had given deliverance unto Syria. He was also a mighty man of valor, but he was a leper. 2 Kings chapter 5 and verse 1. Now, it was about 5 weeks ago, I was speaking to you, I think, on Hezekiah. And I probably had to start, I can't remember quite now, but I probably did start, I think I did, by explaining that we look at these Old Testament passages and characters through the eyes of the New Covenant. The New Testament shows us this. The New Testament writers are prepared to look back into the Old Testament and learn from the experiences of the people there and see valuable lessons coming over into the New Covenant. But we have to be extremely careful when we do this. I'm sure I made this point last time, and I need to make it again. We must not give the impression, it's quite false to give this impression, that the Old Testament is a kind of magic book, and it's just got these accounts in, which we don't take desperately seriously, but we realize that there's deeper meaning there, and we try and find this hidden, deeper meaning. Let me be practical here. There was this man, Naaman, and he was this character that we read of. I just read to you in verse 1, and he had all these things going for him, but he was a leper. And he was, in the end, as I read earlier on, miraculously cured by the command, the declaration of Elisha. By his obedience to that command, washing in the Jordan, miraculously, there was nothing in the Jordan itself, it was a miracle, but he was cleansed of his disease. Now, nothing that I say must detract from that. It's not a myth or a fable or as I say, a magic book with some kind of account that I have to try and find some hidden meaning. All I'm saying is that certain things happened to this man which literally happened to him, but they do, with the eyes of enlightened by the New Covenant, by the gospel, we can look back and say, yes, well, there are certain similarities there. And I'm sure you can see what I'm saying. But I dread the thought that I give you the impression that we treat the Bible, the Old Testament, not seriously in the literal sense. It's all a myth and a fable. I don't want to give that impression at all. It's nothing to do with that. These are real events, real men and women. They really lived, and they really experienced these things. But Paul would, and you can read it in the New Testament over and over again, he often goes back to these accounts and he says, now look, it was like that then and it's like that now. But he moves from the physical into the spiritual. He does it with the law, for example. The law might say something about not doing this and not doing that. And Paul says, there's a principle here with the gospel. And he applies that passage, say in Leviticus or Deuteronomy or somewhere, and he says, now look, that's how it is now. I'll give you an example. He talks about the Passover, 2 Corinthians. And he says, now Christ is our Passover, you see. And we keep the feast. That doesn't mean we actually eat the meat and the herbs and the unleavened bread as they did. No, but spiritually speaking, and he talks about the leaven of sincerity and so on. What he means is you can see looking back into that experience of the Passover, spiritual things for us today. I'm laboring this because I feel it's a very important point. People can get so hooked on this notion of applying the old covenant that they soon forget that they're dealing with real events. And this is extremely dangerous. Having given that preamble, what I'm going to do here is say that whether anybody else here can see it or not, I'm sure you can though, I see in this experience of Naaman, I see something far more important than Naaman ever knew in this experience. And I want to pick out those principles and try and apply them. I think they are valuable lessons for us in doing that. Now, one other further remark. This morning, I can only deal with the first issue. There's too much here to deal with the whole lot in one go. Well, it's possible, but I'm going to break it up. That means I'm going to leave it in a very odd place. I'll try not to leave it in that odd place. I will try and round it off a bit. But really, I'm only dealing with the first point. I admit that before I start. That's why I read verse 1. I'm not speaking on verse 1 to verse 14, which is what I ought to do. I'll come back to the rest in following discourses. So what is the point here then? 2 Kings 5 and verse 1. Now Naaman, captain of the host of the king of Syria, a great man and all the rest of it, but he was a leper. Well, I think what I'm trying to say to you is that Naaman, of course, was unique. Not everybody is the captain of the host. This means that he was, if you like, the chief of the general staff. If you like, let's come down to brass tacks, he was Field Marshal Montgomery, or General Patton in America, or somebody like that. Somebody at the top of the tree, even bigger, even higher than General Patton. He was actually head of the armed forces, head of the army in Syria. Indeed, it says here in verse 5, he was a great man. He was a very important man. He was a substantial man. I'm not told this, but I don't think it's too much of a speculation. He must have been a fairly wealthy man. And he was a great man with his master, the king. He was intimate. A colleague could go in and out of the palace. He was on friendly terms with the top brass. He was the top brass. He had great political influence. It says he was honorable in our version. He was covered in honors and medals and rewards, and he was looked up to. I mean, by the end of the war, Bernard Montgomery, in the eyes of Churchill, could probably do no wrong. Whether he was always right is another matter, but he'd won so many battles, give or take. He'd won so many battles, I think Churchill would have forgiven him anything. He had influence. He became the head of the whole military. Well, this is like Naaman. He's top of the tree. Because he had won great victories. After Alamein, Bernard Montgomery probably could do no wrong. After all the defeats and the losses under Auchinleck and Wavell, whatever the rights and wrongs of that, I'm not debating that now, but some would say these men had laid the ground for Montgomery, but that's not the point. My point is that Montgomery was the man in the spot at the moment. He was not the first choice, Gort was, but he got shot down in a plane. But Montgomery was just the right man in the right time in the right place, and he won a great victory at Alamein, and I think Churchill would have forgiven him anything. He would have given him anything. Because he turned the tide. I think that was a time when Churchill said something like, it's not the end, is it? It's not even I've forgotten what he said, the end of the beginning or the beginning of the end. It was a very clever statement that he made. It is perhaps the end of the beginning of the end or something, or the end of the beginning or something. Yeah. He was over the moon because this man had, well, Naaman's like that. He was also a brave man. He'd served on the front line. He'd gone up through the ranks. What I'm saying is that the record gives it clearly here. This man's got everything going for him. Everything in the garden is rosy for this man, isn't it? I mean, money, power, name, reputation. Remember, Haman was like this, in the court of King Ahasuerus with Esther. Everything was going for Haman. Yeah. He was being feted here, there, and everywhere. He was second in the kingdom, well, third if you think about the queen, I suppose, but he was right up at the top. But the point is, and it's in our text, and this is my point this morning, it's the one single point. For all the pluses, for all the yeses, for all the good things, for all the great things, this man was a career soldier and he reached the top of the tree. He climbed the greasy pole. The text is quite clear. There's a but. There's a but. It was the same with Haman. Haman had it all going for him. Everything in the garden was rosy for Haman. But you remember he went home and his wife said, "What's the matter?" Remember Naboth's vineyard? Ahab said, "Everything's all right, but this chap won't let me have his garden. Everything's all right, but the garden. I want the garden." For Haman, the trouble was Mordecai. This Mordecai wouldn't bow and scrape. And that got under the skin of Haman. Everybody else bowed and scraped when he went by, did all the flummery. but he didn't. Mordecai, the Jew, wouldn't do it. And this really irked Haman. It spoiled everything. It was the fly in the ointment. Now, I don't know if I might be guilty of that the other way around. It occurred to me as I was thinking about this that one September I was in my front garden, and when we lived in Lowestoft, and I was planting out some wallflowers. Now, I wasn't in my Sunday best. I had my old gardening togs on, and my trousers were tied up with binder twine and all the rest of it. And a helicopter landed in the park opposite where we lived. And within a few seconds or minutes, a fleet of cars came pouring out of the entrance of the park and up the road past my house. And there was I standing in the garden looking like a scarecrow. And it was Princess Anne. And I'm afraid you royalists won't like this, but I didn't bow and scrape when she went by. I just stood there like a scarecrow. I have wondered, that was about 40 or 50 years ago, I have wondered if she looked out of the window and she couldn't miss me. I wonder if that got under her skin. I don't know. You see, with Naaman, there's a but. And it's really getting to him. Now, I know that because from the way the story develops, if you remember it, the little slave girl and all the rest of it, nobody told the little slave girl, but she must have heard the conversation in the house. This man must have talked about it. He had this disease. It's called in our old King James Version, it's called leprosy. I'm very doubtful that it's what we know as leprosy. I'm very doubtful about that. It doesn't matter, but I don't think it is leprosy. What I think it is, some dreadful, debilitating, disfiguring, whatever it might be, skin complaint of some kind. That's what, as far as I would go. In fact, it doesn't matter to me. There's something about this man which is the fly in the ointment. It robs him of his joy. That's why I've called this, if you want a title, The Inevitable But. Now, why do I say inevitable? Because I put it to you that although Naaman is unique, I said that at the beginning, there's only one Naaman, there's only one me, as a matter of fact, there's only one you, as a matter of fact. And we're all different. But you know, in a way, we're all exactly the same. Let me try and illustrate this. I don't know if it's just me, but this is my experience. If I've got a discomfort or a pain I go to my GP, my doctor, physician, and, he or she, they want my history. Now tell me when it started and what it's, and all the rest of it. They want to know the symptoms. Now this is my experience. I know what's going to happen because I've thought it out beforehand. I know that when I start to talk, I'll be thinking this. I'm saying something to you, the doctor, it's unique. You've never heard it before. I'm unique. I'm the only one who's got this complaint. I think I'm the only one who's got it. That nobody's ever had this before. And perhaps you don't think like this, but I do. I tend to think my history sounds so wacky that I'm the only one who says it. But I'm pretty convinced from what I know of GPs that if I said that to the GP, they would say something like, I've had 3 or 4 of you this week like this. You know, they're always listening to it. In fact, I knew a GP, I think I've told you before, my GP, I wondered how many times people came to him and said how depressed they were. Well, his wife was shockingly depressive, very badly so. And I wondered how many times he must have thought to himself, you think you're depressed? Come home with me and I'll show you a real case. My GP once told me, the same man, that whenever a patient, he said goodbye to a patient, he always got up and went out into the secretary's office for no reason at all. There was nothing he had to do. It was just to give him a break. He's heard it so many times. I wonder how many people go in and say, I've got a backache. I read a book written by a GP once, and he said the worst case, with respect, was a middle-aged woman who came in saying she had a headache. She suffered from headaches. Yes. Almost difficult to find, almost impossible to find out what it means. We had a friend once whose wife was admitted to Swindon Hospital, Princess Margaret's Hospital as it happened, and she was admitted because she was having continuous vomiting. She couldn't keep her food down. And Mr. Gingell, I think it was, came home to a meal to us after he visited his wife, and he'd seen the consultant. And the consultant said, I think this is right, I can't remember the figures exactly, I think he said something like, well, there are 200 reasons for this continual vomiting, and we got to find out the real one. You see, it's very common, it's happening all the time, you know, and you think you're unique. What I'm saying to you about Naaman, in some ways, he's absolutely special. You could say this morning, well, I'm not a military person, I'm not important, I haven't got honors. No. But the point about Naaman, I think, is not the honors, not the greatness, not the glory, not the fame, not the top of the tree, it's the but. And I say to you, that but is inevitable. What do I mean by that? Joseph Hart wrote a hymn, and this line is in it, and some of you will remember the line. He's talking to believers in their suffering and trials, and he said, in our darkest hours we prize, he said. We have some dark hours, yes we do. But then he has a line, there's something, in all our darkest hours, he said, there's something secret. Can you finish it? There's something secret sweetens all. There's something secret sweetens all. That was his experience. Whenever I've been through it, he said, God always makes sure that I find something in it that lifts it somehow, comforts me. Well, I put it to you the other way around, the other side of the coin. I put it to you that Mr. Everyman, or Mrs. Everywoman, whatever you want, every one of us, we can have everything going for us in life. We can have a big house, well settled, a good job, everything. But there's always something, like Haman, like Naaman. There's always something that spoils it. I think that's the point for me that I want to make this morning. It won't be a long discourse. Now, I don't very often quote Augustine. He's not my favorite. That may offend somebody, I don't know, but he's not my favorite. But on this occasion, I can quote him. There's a famous saying of Augustine, and it's this. In every one of us, he said, there is something missing. And he said, until that thing is put right, we're always going to be restless. His point was, there's a gap in everybody. And that gap can only be filled by God himself. And until that gap is filled, we're never going to find full satisfaction. You get a new car. It's the latest model. It's got everything you could wish for. Bluetooth, whatever you want, sat navs coming, everything right. It's wonderful. But you know the experience. You won't have had that car and driven it many miles, and there'll be something about it that you wish could be improved or changed or whatever. I had two neighbors just below me. They were old friends, long, long before I knew them. And one was a shipwright, and the other was a builder. And I don't know whether the shipwright man had done something which helped the builder in their youth, I don't know. And the builder said this: if we can find a plot of land, I'll build us both a house, a house each. And they did find a plot of land. They must have bought the plot below me long before ever I got there. And they built. The builder built these two houses next to each other. But of course they had to decide who was going to get which. I don't know how they decided it, but the builder man got the northern side, and the other man, the shipwright, got the southern side. I often wondered if, because of where the sun would be, or something about the house, even though they designed it themselves and had it fitted out exactly as they wanted it, I wonder, after the first week of living in the house, somebody was saying, I wish I'd put that window there, or I wish the stairs had been, whatever. There's something that spoils it. Why? Why is it inevitable? Well, I think it comes from Adam. I'm sure it comes from Adam. Adam is the classic case. Everything is right for Adam. He's in the garden. It's all going well. And what happens? He sins. And from then on, it all goes wrong. Nothing goes right. He's frightened. He's scared out of his wits. He starts hiding from God. He starts covering up. He starts making excuses. He starts blaming everybody else in the street. His son becomes a murderer. The Bible tells me, 4 as in Adam, all die. And that's what I see in Naaman. I'm not saying Naaman had a skin complaint because he was a particular sinner. I'm not saying that leprosy was sin. That's not what I'm saying. I'm just saying that sin ruins everything. That's what it is. 4 as in Adam, all die. There's something secret, ruins all. My barber has just gone on a Mediterranean cruise. He started last Thursday. It's a 12-day cruise. Well, I wonder, he's been going about 2 or 3 days. I wonder if it's turned out like the brochure said. I wonder if he did feel quite fit and well when he crossed the Bay of Biscay. I wonder if there's a but. I wonder if the food isn't quite right. I had some unusual food yesterday because I was at a wedding, and a bit posh, I suppose, the food. And why did I sort of taste it again about 6 or 7 hours later? Why did I taste it again? What was it about this herbs or whatever they put in it. What I'm saying is it's never quite what you think, is it? Why? And I'm convinced it's sin in it. At the root of it. Romans 8 tells me this world is full of misery and suffering. These lovely birds you see flying about, lovely. They're frightened to death because they're watching for the hawk. And the hawk is watching for this. And this is watching for that. They're all watching. There's always something. And my friend, for us, this is where I have to leave it this morning. There's always something in our lives. There's always something about our experience. And I think it comes from Adam and the fall, Genesis 3. This is why Genesis 3 is so important. This is something that ruins all. There's this inevitable but. And it always will be there until something gets rid of the but. Augustine again. Emptiness is there until God fills it. For as in Adam all die, even so in Christ. There's the answer. Now, we're very good at hiding from this and covering up. I've given a lot of illustrations this morning, but there's another one. It's just happened in my life. An acquaintance, yesterday week, found that his elbow was inflamed. He didn't know why, but his elbow was inflamed and quite red and sore and, all the rest of it. And he noticed, that he and his wife, that the redness was actually creeping up his arm. So his wife rang 111. And they said, take him to Poole Trauma Clinic. And so they took him to Poole Trauma Clinic, and Poole Trauma Clinic said, you've got to come in. And they put him on intravenous antibiotics. That worked so far, but not good enough, and they had to operate on Friday to get to the root of the problem. What I'm saying is this. If a GP or some medical person had said, well, I can stop that for you, and they'd put a nice bandage on it, see, so he can't see it, that wouldn't be the answer. I've got this soreness. Well, I can stop that. And he puts a nice cream on it, and he covers it with this nice powder, and then he puts this bandage on it. By now, that man probably would have been dead of sepsis. The medical people knew they didn't have to cover it up. They didn't have to get rid of the symptoms only, hide the symptoms, powder the symptoms, paint the symptoms, whatever, cover it up in some way. Naaman has this problem. It's obviously getting to him. It's in the family. They're talking about it. He knows it. He knows it. He can have all his money. He can have all his medals. He can have all his pomp. But until he gets this thing sorted out, it's never going to be right. What I want to say to sinners is this. You can hide from God. You can run from God. You can hide from yourself. You can pretend to yourself. We're all masters at it. We're all masters at it. But until we get the root of the problem sorted out, it's never going to be right. Now, this is breaking off at a bad place. Naaman did get to the root of the problem. He couldn't do it, nor could the king, nor could the king of Israel. Nobody could do it except the prophet. But the prophet had the answer. Naaman didn't like the answer. Naaman scoffed at the answer. But somebody had the wit to tell him to come to his senses. And he did obey the prophet. And as we shall see, well, as I read to you, this man was thoroughly cured. It's an illustration of the gospel to me. How many won't listen to the gospel? How many won't hear or won't listen or won't heed, won't obey the invitations, the commands, the call? God commands us to repent. He invites us to Christ. Come unto me, and so on, all of it. Now you say, well, you're dealing with Naaman. Why don't you deal with a real king? I could deal with Paul, Saul of Tarsus, in Acts chapter 9. If you read that, you will find that Christ says to him, okay, Saul, you're coming to Damascus. Everything is in the garden, lovely for you, isn't it? You get up in the morning, you're eager, you're trying to serve God, you really think you're serving God, and you're going after these so-called Christians, and you're trying to put them to death, you're trying to stop me, you're trying to put Christ to death, and you're doing God's work, and you're really wonderfully happy about it all. But he said, there's a but, isn't there? Do you know what the but was for Paul? Do you remember what Christ said? You've been kicking, he said, all the time against the goads. Yes, everything is good. Everything is wonderful, Saul. But it isn't. I think he's referring back to Stephen's death. I think Saul's conscience has been getting to him. I think he's been troubled by something. I think he's realized that the gospel is right. And although he's stifling this sensation of Christ, and indeed it may well be that he's trying to persecute believers just to stifle it, he can't. And Christ exposes it. I don't know if I'm addressing anybody with any relevance here this morning, but is anybody running away from this but? Until you get right with God, nothing will be right. You can dismiss the gospel, you can laugh at it like Naaman did. But the truth is, he had the grace given to him. I don't know what else to put it, how else to put it. To submit to the gospel, however foolish it may have seemed to him, however much he may have despised it, he submitted to what the prophet told him. And he had a miraculous cure. But I leave it here this morning. There is the inevitable but. And run away as much as we will from this but, it will never leave us. I believe it's God's purpose in chasing us to himself. May God make us awaken us to this sense of our need, this emptiness, whatever it might be, however much we have, the sense that all is not well, however we want to express it. I've called it the inevitable but. May God awaken us to that in our lives so that we can come to the cure, of course. That's the main point. Well, I've left it in a strange place, but we'll take on next time. May God bless his word to us then.